Clara had always believed that promises from the people who raised you were unbreakable. That words spoken in the quiet glow of a fireplace, or whispered over warm cups of cocoa on stormy nights, carried weight deeper than any contract. And for as long as she could remember, her grandparents had made her a single, steady promise. The house would always be hers. The old countryside estate wasn't just walls, beams, and dusty corners. It was the place she first learned how to ride a bike on the gravel driveway, where she fell asleep listening to the whistle of wind against the cracked shutters, where cherry blossoms rained down each spring like confetti, and where her great-grandfather's photograph still hung proudly in the hallway, his stern face softened by the knowledge that he had built the place with his own calloused hands after returning from the war. She had been told countless times, "This house is your roots, Clara. It's your legacy. One day, it will be yours to protect." Those words weren't just comforting. They became her anchor through years of turbulence. Because while her parents' lives crumbled under irresponsibility and selfish choices, her grandparents' home stood strong, steady, immovable. Her father vanished when she was only 10 years old, walking out with nothing more than a suitcase and leaving behind only memories of broken promises and unpaid bills. Her mother, fragile and lost, drifted from one bad decision to another, her life a carousel of short-lived relationships, disappointments, and neglect that left Clara emotionally abandoned. Through all of that, her grandparents became her shelter. They gave her more than food and a roof. They gave her traditions, values, and the belief that loyalty defined true family, not mere bloodlines. They nurtured her dreams, clapped at every recital, hugged her at every failure, and instilled in her the pride that one day she wouldn't just inherit land. She would inherit history, love, and responsibility all bundled into that weathered house. When Clara finally made it to college, it was with the knowledge that she had a foundation most people didn't. While her friends worried about where life would take them, she felt steady, rooted in the promise of the estate. She imagined herself renovating it, modernizing some rooms while keeping the soul of the house intact. She pictured future family dinners under the old oak tree, perhaps even raising children of her own there someday, children who would run barefoot across the same creaky floors she had once loved. Even on her most exhausting days, late-night study sessions, juggling part-time jobs to cover expenses, she carried within her the certainty that she was building toward a life that already had a center. Her grandparents were aging, yes, but they often reassured her, sometimes with laughter in their eyes, sometimes with a firm squeeze of her hand. "Don't worry, Clara. This house will never leave you. This is yours." Then came the Tuesday morning that fractured everything. Clara was seated at her small apartment's kitchen counter, sipping coffee as sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds when her phone buzzed. It was her grandmother, cheerful as always. Their conversations were usually filled with recipes, garden updates, and small talk about neighbors Clara barely remembered, so she answered with a smile. But as the conversation meandered, her grandmother mentioned it so casually, so lightly, as though remarking on the weather. "Oh, Clara, we had some people come by last week. They were very interested in the property." The word property clanged in Clara's head, unfamiliar and cold, so different from the warm word home she had always used. She froze, her coffee cup suspended in midair, heart thudding. "Interested?" she repeated, her voice tight. "Interested in what?" Her grandmother chuckled softly, as though Clara were overreacting. "The house, dear. We thought it best to let it go. We've already signed." For a moment, Clara thought she had misheard. Her ears rang, her pulse quickened, and she whispered, "You mean, you sold it?" She could almost hear her grandmother smiling through the phone, oblivious to the devastation unfolding on the other end. "Yes, dear. Times are hard, and we can't keep up with them anymore. It was the right thing to do." Clara's vision blurred. She set her cup down so hard the ceramic cracked against the counter, hot liquid spilling over her hand. Her voice shook as she stammered, But you promised. You told me." She couldn't finish the sentence, because it felt like the ground beneath her had given way. All the years of certainty, all the childhood memories of her grandparents assuring her that the estate was her inheritance, had just shattered in an instant. She tried to push back, to ask questions, but her grandmother's tone remained infuriatingly calm. "Don't be upset, darling. You're young. You'll have plenty of chances to make a life of your own. A house is just wood and stone. But Clara knew it wasn't just wood and stone. It was Sunday dinners, whispered secrets under quilts, laughter echoing in hallways, and the one thread of stability she had ever known. Now strangers, people she had never met, people who saw the place not as history, but as profit, were claiming what was rightfully hers. Clara hung up the phone in a daze, her body trembling, her heart heavy with betrayal. She paced her apartment, every step like a drumbeat of disbelief. How could they have done this without even telling her, without giving her the chance to step in, to offer help, to save the one thing that meant more to her than anything else? She thought back to every holiday, every promise, every moment her grandparents had told her she would never have to worry, and now she felt as though every word had been a lie. The certainty that had carried her through so much suddenly crumbled into ash. She spent the rest of the day in silence, unable to eat, unable to think of anything but that single revelation. Her inheritance was gone, not to misfortune, not to fate, but because the very people who had taught her to trust, to believe in family loyalty, had chosen to sell it away. And as night fell, Clara lay awake in her small, impersonal apartment, staring at the ceiling, her chest burning with the realization that she had been robbed not just of property, but of her identity, her legacy, and her trust. Clara drove as though every mile between her apartment and the countryside estate was a barrier she could tear down with sheer rage, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles whitened, her eyes burning with unshed tears, her mind replaying her grandmother's calm words again and again, words that had casually undone the foundation of her entire life. The closer she got, the more her chest constricted, the more the landscape around her, the trees she had climbed as a child, the roadside diner her grandfather used to take her to after church, the winding dirt paths she once thought led to secret adventures, seemed to twist into something hostile and unrecognizable. When she finally turned onto the long driveway, her heart stopped. There it was, planted in the earth like a cruel joke, a bright red and white sign, bold black letters spelling sold. Clara slammed the brakes, the tires crunching over gravel, her body jerking forward as though the car itself had been struck by the weight of betrayal. Her eyes darted past the sign and fell upon two men in sharp suits, walking the grounds as though they were inspecting livestock, pointing to the cherry trees that had once showered her with blossoms in spring, gesturing at the porch where she had once curled up with books and her grandmother's quilt, their voices carrying across the breeze as if they owned the very air. She felt sick watching them. Strangers dissecting her memories as if they were nothing more than profit margins. Before she knew it, her door was flung open and she was marching toward the house, fury pounding in her veins like war drums. She pushed past the smell of fresh paint and unfamiliar cologne lingering from the new owner's visit, and when she entered, she found her grandparents sitting in the kitchen as though it were any ordinary day, their cups of tea steaming gently on the table, their faces serene, detached, as if they hadn't just uprooted her world. "How could you?" The words burst out of her before she even realized she was speaking, her voice hoarse, trembling, desperate. Her grandmother's hand paused halfway to her teacup, her grandfather's gaze dropping instantly to the floor, and Clara's chest heaved as she forced herself to continue. "You promised me this house. You told me it would always be mine. You raised me on that promise. And now you've given it away to strangers as if it meant nothing to you." Her grandfather sighed, the sound heavy, worn, like the groan of a collapsing door. And though his lips parted, his eyes never once rose to meet hers. "We're old, Clara," he said finally, his tone flat, resigned. "We don't have the strength to keep this place up. The roof leaks, the taxes are high, and the land requires work neither of us can do anymore. They offered good money, and we need it for our care." His words, practical and cold, cut deeper than any blade, because they were not lies. She knew the house had its flaws, knew her grandparents' bodies had grown frail with the years. But it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about wood and stone. It was about trust, about loyalty, about the promise that family was stronger than business. "I would have helped," Clara cried, her voice breaking into jagged edges. "I would have paid the taxes. I would have fixed the roof. I would have done anything. But you didn't even give me the chance. You didn't even tell me before you signed it away." Her grandmother's lips trembled with the faintest smile, the kind of condescending softness that once comforted Clara as a child, but now burned her like acid. "You're young, darling," she murmured, her words slow, careful, as though speaking to someone who didn't understand the world. "You'll build your own life. This place, it's just wood and stone, memories and walls. You'll make new ones." Clara's body shook with anger. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her vision blurring with tears that refused to fall. "No," she snapped, her voice cracking like thunder. "It's not just wood and stone. It's my history. It's every story you told me about great-grandfather building this place with his bare hands. It's every night you tucked me in here when my mother forgot to come home. It's every holiday we celebrate together. It's everything you raised me to believe in. And you've sold it off like it was worthless. Like I was worthless." She could feel the air shift then, the tension thickening as her words cut through the silence of the kitchen, and that was when one of the men in suits appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame as though the house already belonged to him. He exchanged a look with his colleague before turning his gaze on Clara, his expression laced with mild annoyance and smug amusement, and with a smirk that twisted her stomach, he said, "Sorry, miss. Business is business." The phrase echoed in her ears, mocking, final, as though her memories, her childhood, her very identity could be reduced to a transaction. That smirk etched itself into her mind like a scar, something she knew she would never forget. A symbol of how cruel the world could be when money and convenience outweighed loyalty and love. Clara's knees weakened beneath her, but she stood her ground, staring at him with burning eyes before turning back to her grandparents, silently pleading for some sign of remorse, some recognition of the pain they had inflicted. But her grandfather still wouldn't meet her gaze, and her grandmother only looked at her with a tired sadness that seemed more like regret for Clara's anger than regret for their betrayal. Realizing there would be no undoing what had been done, Clara finally turned and walked out, the walls of the house pressing in on her as though they were forcing her out, the familiar creaks of the floorboards sounding like farewells she hadn't agreed to give. She pushed past the men, ignoring their whispers, her feet pounding down the porch steps, her chest heavy with grief and fire. As she climbed into her car, her tears finally spilled, hot and relentless, blurring her vision as she gripped the wheel once more. The countryside blurred around her as she drove, but this time, it wasn't nostalgia she saw in the fields and trees. It was betrayal carved into every blade of grass, every stone wall, every shadow of memory. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, the tears had dried, replaced by something sharper, something harder. The grief still sat heavy in her chest, but beneath it grew a flame, fierce and unyielding. They had taken her inheritance, stripped her of the one thing she thought untouchable. But Clara knew she could not allow this to be the end of the story. Betrayal had always been the prelude to strength in her life. Her father's abandonment had made her independent. Her mother's neglect had made her resilient. And now her grandparents' decision would make her relentless. As she pulled into her apartment's lot, she whispered to herself, her voice low, steady, a promise she intended to keep. They may have signed the papers, but this fight isn't over. No one gets to erase my history. No one. And with that, Clara stepped out of the car, her legs trembling but her resolve unshakable, carrying with her not just the pain of betrayal, but the fire of defiance, the kind that could turn even the deepest wound into a weapon. Clara spent the days after the confrontation in a fog of rage and sorrow, her mind running in endless circles, her chest heavy with a mix of grief and determination. And though at first the betrayal felt like an open wound too raw to touch, soon it hardened into something sharper, a quiet but burning resolve that told her she could not let this end here. Because if she walked away, if she accepted that strangers now held the keys to her legacy, then she would not only lose the house but also every memory, every lesson, every fragment of her childhood that had been tied to it. And she refused to allow her grandparents' careless decision and the smug grins of opportunists to define her future. So she began the fight the only way she knew how: research. Every evening after work, she came home to her small, dimly lit apartment and surrounded herself with stacks of papers, binders and books borrowed from libraries and legal offices, her laptop glowing against the shadows as she scoured inheritance laws, property records, and family wills late into the night. Her desk, once neat, soon became a battlefield of highlighted statutes, handwritten notes and coffee-stained printouts, Each scrap of information pieced together like evidence in a trial only she seemed to care about. She combed through the dusty old boxes her mother had left behind, searching for anything: an old letter, a deed, a copy of her great-grandfather's will that might support her case. And slowly, through exhaustion and sheer obsession, she began to find cracks in the sale. Her grandparents had been the legal owners. Yes, but previous wills had clearly named her as heir. Her inheritance recognized by law even if her grandparents had chosen to ignore it in their haste to sell. It wasn't airtight, but it was something, and to Clara, something was enough to spark hope. With shaking hands, she called the buyers, demanding they withdraw, telling them they had no right to what wasn't truly theirs. But they only laughed, their voices dripping with arrogance, one of them sneering into the phone. "Too late. We own it now. You'll never get it back." Their mocking tone reignited the fire in her chest. No longer just grief, but defiance. No longer just heartbreak, but war. If they thought she was some naive girl too sentimental to fight, they were wrong. Clara was not a child anymore. She was a woman forged in abandonment, in disappointment, in betrayal, and every scar on her heart had prepared her for this moment. So she sought help. She scraped together her savings and found a lawyer willing to take on her case. A sharp-eyed woman named Delaney who didn't flinch when Clara spilled her story through choked tears. Delaney listened, tapping her pen against her notebook, and finally said, "They pressured your grandparents into selling for far less than this property is worth, didn't they? That's exploitation. We can work with that. It'll be tough, it'll take time, but if you're ready to fight, I'll fight with you." Clara nodded without hesitation, her hands trembling but her jaw set, because she knew she couldn't turn back now. The months that followed tested her more than she had ever been tested. Court filings, hearings, endless stacks of documents that had to be read and reread, signed and notarized. Nights spent sleepless, staring at the ceiling as doubts whispered in her mind. What if you lose? What if the house is gone forever? What if you're only chasing ghosts? But every time those fears crept in, she thought of her great-grandfather's calloused hands laying the bricks, of her grandmother's voice telling her stories in that very kitchen, of the cherry trees blossoming in spring like the earth itself was celebrating life. And she pushed forward. She endured the smirks of the buyer's lawyers, men who looked at her as if she were an inconvenience, a sentimental fool wasting the court's time. But she learned quickly to ignore them, to hold her head high and let her determination speak louder than their condescension. Her grandparents, frail and ashamed, eventually admitted under questioning that they had been pressured into selling below market value, their desperation for quick money clouding their judgment, and though Clara's heart ached hearing them confess it, though part of her wanted to scream at them for giving away what was never truly theirs to sell, another part of her felt a flicker of compassion. They had been manipulated, taken advantage of, and in their weakness they had hurt her. But they too had been victims of greed. The legal battle dragged on, each hearing like a storm she had to weather, each delay another weight on her spirit. But she refused to give up. She learned to balance exhaustion with discipline, to carry herself with quiet strength even when her insides were trembling, and through it all, she began to transform. The girl who had once relied on promises to steady her now relied on her own will, her own fire, her own refusal to bow. And then, after months of grueling back and forth, after endless nights of despair and hope clashing inside her, justice tipped at last. The court ruled in her favor. The contract was declared exploitative, and the sale was void. The house, the estate, her legacy, was restored to its rightful heir under the original will. Clara sat in the courtroom, her breath catching in her chest, her vision blurring with tears she didn't try to hide, as the words washed over her like rain after drought. The property is granted to Ms. Clara Reynolds. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The relief and sorrow colliding so fiercely it felt like her heart might shatter all over again, but this time from triumph. The day she returned to the estate, keys clutched in her hand. The air felt different, heavier with memory but lighter with victory. She walked slowly up the driveway, past the cherry trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering like old friends welcoming her home. The porch creaked beneath her feet as it always had, the boards familiar and forgiving, and as she pushed open the door, the smell of dust and history rushed to meet her. Her grandparents were there, frail and humbled, their eyes red-rimmed and wet as they watched her step across the threshold. They didn't speak at first, and Clara didn't either, because forgiveness was not something that could be summoned instantly. Betrayal leaves scars too deep for quick healing, but in their silence, there was understanding, a recognition that they had wronged her, that they had broken something precious. And though it would take time, they hoped one day she might forgive. Clara stood in the living room, her chest rising and falling as she let her gaze travel across the familiar walls, the photograph still hanging slightly askew, the worn carpet still carrying the faint imprint of decades of footsteps. And she realized something powerful. The house was no longer just a building, no longer just a promise. It was proof that betrayal could be turned into strength, that loyalty could be reclaimed not by words but by action, and that legacies were worth fighting for even when everyone else had given up. As the sun began to set, spilling gold through the windows and painting the walls in warm light, Clara stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the crisp evening air. The fields stretched before her, endless and alive, the cherry trees silhouetted against the fading sky, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months, peace, fragile but real. She wrapped her arms around herself, her lips trembling as she whispered, half to the house, half to the ghosts of the past, and half to her own future. This is mine, and I'll never let anyone take it away again. And in that moment, Clara wasn't just the girl who had been betrayed, wasn't just the woman who had fought. She was the heir, the protector, the keeper of a legacy she had bled for, cried for, and ultimately won back with her own strength. And she knew that no matter what came next, no matter what battles the world still had in store for her, she would face them with the same unyielding fire. Because once you've reclaimed what was stolen, once you've proven that your roots cannot be severed, you become unbreakable.